Hi, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours. If you are watching on YouTube, you can find out more about what we do at officehours.global. First hour is general discussion, things that we're interested in, things that we think, in all areas of media and virtual production. Second hour is usually something specific, things that we've decided to spend a little bit more time on. Today we have Michael Krasny, who is a very well-known interviewer. He was the host of Forum here in San Francisco for over 20 years. So anyway, he's going to join us and answer your questions. If you have questions about interviewing, it's going to be very exciting. And then on Friday, tomorrow, we'll have the founders of MakerPipe here. A lot of us have gotten into it, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Of course, on Saturday, as the long day, we have education from 8 to 10. We don't broadcast that, so you have to be in Zoom. And then at noon, we're going back to the Accidental Theater in Belfast with the Belfast Method. And so it should be exciting. We are cooking. Our chef on Sunday is Shannon Cooper. She's going to show you how to make pierogies. so it's a family it's the family recipe. So anyway, I highly recommend thinking about it. I'm excited. So anyway, that's what we have coming up. And I'm going to handle a tech issue real quick. So I'm going to drop out for a little bit. Bill's going to take over for host, and I'll be back probably by the bottom of the hour. All right, take it away, Bill.
Excellent. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us in Office Hours. As always, we are going to have an interesting conversation today. Those of you who have not maybe joined us in Office Hours before, this is an interesting interactive panel where every morning we have panelists and the viewers of the panel send in questions, and this amazing expert panel that you are seeing in your grid view in Zoom, handle those questions, and we're going to dive right in. I think the most exciting thing is to just deal with questions. So I don't have a list of who's going to hand raise here, but let's go through the first question. And is it Lois that's the reader today, or who's handling reading? Oh, it's okay. Good.
Thank you, Bill.
Mitchell?
It's Mitchell. And it's a pleasure to follow you. And the first question comes from Juan C. Robles in Mexico. The latest Zoom update, now with automatic update functionality, offers slow or fast update channels. Any preference for office hours, after hours meetings?
And Jason Bache is our first answerer. So Jason, take it away.
All right, I'll take a stab at this. The answer is you should be on slow unless for some reason you need to be something other than slow. If there is a fix that you are really hot to trot to get working, I would say keep it on slow, because slow, I believe, is the same thing as it used to be for just updating every day.
And it's important to keep things updated. Let's move on to Rupert McCrae.
I'm still a bit cautious of this. You don't have to enable the auto updates, and I just personally prefer to keep an eye on the release notes, know what's coming, know what features are going to be affected, and then just choose when to do it myself.
It's been interesting. The software vendors, in my experience, have been getting better at pushing updates that don't break things. But that said, I believe in Rupert's cautious approach. You don't want to break things, particularly if it's mission critical and has a business function for you. Let's move on to the next question.
And it's A. Mitchells from Washington, asking a question about somebody that just asked the last question. Juan C. Robles is always working on something amazing when he shows his screen. Would it be possible for him to have a workshop hour for a tour of the things he is working on? Since it's screen shares, no cameras required if he just wants to be on mic.
So far, we haven't had anybody in the panel doing a presentation who has just been audio, but this is up to Alex to schedule. And as always, the Discord that Office Hours provides, and for those of you who haven't gotten in and participated in the Discord system, the Discord link is set out in a specific time zone at the beginning of every show. If you're on Discord, you can ask for topics to be discussed in Office Hours, and those are where Alex draws most of the themes for the show. So definitely put that in if that's something you'd like to do, and hopefully in a future show, you'll get your wish. Let's move on.
Yeah, I didn't think I'd be asking a heavy metal question, but Douglas Carmichael asks the question, Iron Maiden will be touring in 2022, and frontman Bruce Dickinson is known to captain the band 747 himself. Given the high energy of their shows, wouldn't it be a false economy and a possible safety risk to have the singer both sing and pilot?
Well, as long as he doesn't go on virtually and sing from the cockpit, Those polymaths who are able to do multiple things extraordinarily well always amaze me. Jason, go ahead, take on.
I don't think that it's a safety risk unless he's a rotten pilot. At the end of the day, tours have insurance, just like productions have insurance. And if for some reason they're unaware of it, then I suppose you could call that a false economy, but that's not generally how it's referred to. Long story short, no. As long as the tour insurer or insurance underwriter knows about this, nope.
It's an interesting idea because I was always told that there are old pilots and bold pilots, but no old, bold pilots. So I've always thought that pilots are people who are very specifically dedicated to like checklists and doing it right. On the other hand, rock and roll singers tend to be a little looser in how they do things. I guess not all of them, because it's great if you can manage to do both at the same time. Let's move on to the next question.
Scott Mueller, Germantown, New York. It was mentioned that the -24 LUF standard in Office Hours 2.0 may change. What level will you change it and why?
So from all the conversations we've had about this, and Mickey McAdor, who is not with us today, but has been on many of the office hours and is one of our resident audio gurus, established the -24 LUF standard as something that he thought was appropriate in this era. In the change from analog to digital, there was a lot of discussion about what level. Let's hear from both Jeffrey Powers and Jason Bache about how they felt it developed. Jeffrey, go ahead.
Yeah, so -24 was made because we didn't know how the microphones were going to work because our microphones could handle higher sounds, but anything like educators' microphones, the Piles and the Polsons and stuff like that, we're not 100% sure how that was going to work. So 24, it actually started at 26, if I remember correct, and then moved up to 24. So now that's we're finding that to be a little bit too low for production. So it's probably going to bump up and go from there. So yeah, when I do any of my shows, I try to stay at about 24, but sometimes I'll have to bump it up just because of the fact that some people just can't hear you, and that's the.
It's the classic line about standards. The great thing about standards is there are so many of them. Jason Bache, take it on.
Okay. I believe actually right at the very beginning of office hours, we were at -20. What you need to understand about this is it is an esoteric thing once you're in a pocket. So for example, the way that I was taught to gain stage a microphone was, set it to pre-fader, listen, solo the channel, and then turn your gain up until you are kissing the yellow. And of course, the yellow is not a technical term. The yellow is the same on every single mixer. No, it's not. It's not the same on every single mixer. It just isn't. So, long story short, LUF's decibels, none of these, where do I go with this? Decibels are not a non-linear standard, which means the lowest decibel and the loudest decibel are not the same decibel. Just like, percentage, you're installing something on your computer, the last percentage and the first percentage are not the same amount of time. Like, it is not the same slice of a pie. Zoom will equalize us to pretty much wherever it decides we need to be, and we're always chasing that. So the answer is no idea what it will change, if it'll change, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter as long as everyone can participate.
Yeah, one of the things that was one of the biggest transitions in my career was going from analog VU meters, where there used to be a thing called soft clipping. If you drove a microphone really hard and you got up to the top of the red for moments, it actually sounded pretty good, and people liked that sound. As soon as the digital thing came in, when a digital signal gets beyond 255 in video, or at the top of the thing and goes one increment over, the whole signal falls apart. And I was shocked in the early days when I would overdrive a mic in the digital realm and it would just sound horrible. I mean, literally it was unintelligible with that last little bit over the top end. So everybody is trying to figure out how much farther down from that top end can we go to provide a lot of headroom and still make sounds that are robust and reach the appropriate levels for engineering. And I'm constantly being asked in my video practice to deliver various standards. Often in the web asks for -16 decibels, 24 decibels, sometimes 28 decibels. It's just, or LUF, excuse me. It's just a very complicated rolling target. And the best thing to do is if you're delivering to somebody, just ask them what their targets are and adhere to them. That way you won't fail on quality control. Oh, we've got other people tossing in. Jesse Mills, go ahead. And then Mitchell Hill after that.
Yeah, simple answer is that negative 24 is just a TV and film standard. So maybe that's why Mickey chose it, and YouTube is at negative 14. So if Office Hours 2.0 ultimate destination is YouTube, it may arrive at something like that.
I'm going to have to change. I still have negative 16 written down for most of my internal web deliveries. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Thank you, Bill. In the old days, and we'll just say analog days, it was important to get the volume up as high as you could without overdriving. But when you went into overdriving on analog systems, it was a nice, steady curve of saturation that would generally happen. With digital, once you hit zero, there's nothing left. So we're a lot more careful about overdriving a digital chain because once it hits zero, there's nothing left. There's no bits available to push through. And also, just for reference, 1 decibel is the smallest amount of change that the typical human ear can hear.
All right, let's move ahead. We've managed to cover that pretty well. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Jack B. from Phoenix, Arizona has a question from the category guest scheduling. When you have already rearranged schedules for a guest and they no-show, what do you do? Cancel the show or just plow ahead? Viewers' numbers are much higher than our shows with guests.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Well, first of all, there's a lot of factors that it might depend on. The first one would be as when they do cancel. If they decide to cancel a day or two or something like that, where you can give enough ample time to let people know, hey, this we're going to have to reschedule it, then you could probably cancel a show. However, I go on the TV rule, and that basically is if they have a guest that cancels on a regular TV show, they still have to do a show. It's not like they can just turn off and put on some rerun. They probably could, I suppose, but they're not going to. Always have something in the background to pick up on, and I find that sometimes when guests cancel last minute, you can put together a great show and have even a better episode than if the guest was there at times if you have it planned correctly.
I know Alex has talked a lot about having primary, secondary, and sometimes even tertiary backup plans, and I'm a great believer in that. I mean, things do happen at the last minute, and if you've promoted the fact that you're putting on a show at a particular time and some supposed linchpin of that falls out, you have to have somewhere to go to, because it's usually not acceptable to just throw up a card or to say, hey, we're going to rerun a past show. Generally, because at least in the old days, the shows were dependent on advertisers, and if they were coming expecting to see a big guest and that guest is canceled, if they don't throw somebody in of equal stature or at least somebody who can handle the show for that, they're going to lose people in droves. And then the advertisers are going to come back again in the old broadcast system and say, hey, refund some of our money. We are paid for these audience levels and you didn't deliver what you were paying for. Now, in views, it may work a little bit different in the new internet era, but it's your brand, and your brand will be stronger if you have great backup plans to move forward, regardless of what you're doing. Always have a secondary and a tertiary backup if you can. That's how I view the world. I think, and since we haven't got anybody else weighing in on that, let's move on to the next question.
I believe Lois Richter was standing by to answer that question also, Bill.
Oh, was she? I'm sorry, she's not on my screen. So Lois, definitely dive in.
So I don't do a television show anymore. I've switched to radio, and there are frequently times when the guest that's supposed to be there is not there. You're ready to go on, and they're not in the room. So luckily on the radio, I can play some songs while I walk out and go find out, call them up, see what's going on. If they're just a no-show, I'll grab somebody else in the studio and they'll come in and we'll talk about something. We'll either talk about a topic or I'll interview them or whatever. So it's a matter of if your on-air host is able to wing it, wing it.
We've seen this a million times on office hours, and we've talked about it. This idea of somebody on presentation and the floor director is going, stretch, we're not ready yet. Just find something to say. And the people who can do that brilliantly are really, that's why they become such highly paid hosts. I'm reminded of, who is it on CNN? Anderson Cooper had a rain out of a big signature event just a couple of months ago, and they literally had to stretch for 2 to 3 hours. And it's almost a master class in how to suddenly from, I'm just going to host and I'm not going to really present much, I'm going to be a facilitator, to the camera's on me every minute of 2 hours, and I have to come up with things to do to make it this interesting for the audience. He pulled it off, I thought, brilliantly, but it's a skill, definite skill. Let's move on.
Next question from Noah Sargent in Fullerton, California. Noah asks, is there any sort of training, write-up, etc. on the cutting process for Office Hours 2.01 or 2.02? What's the difference?
We don't have anybody who's raised their hand, and I don't really feel comfortable talking about this. Not that it's any kind of secret, but I know that Alex is working really hard, and this is a moving target. So I think some of you who are listening have probably been in the situation where you've got something, it's ongoing, it's doing well, people are asking you for training, but it's still evolving. So, where do you create the balance between stopping and writing a manual for something and continue its development? So, I know there will be a lot more formalized training for the roles we do here and for 2.0.1 and the rest of that going forward. But they have to finish up, at least get solidified to a certain point where writing those manuals makes sense, at least in my opinion. And I'm sorry, Alex isn't here. Oh, good. Lois has popped in, and so has Jason. So Lois, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that right now what we do is we ask the community. So in after hours, I go in and I say, how does this work? If I do that, what happens? Does that look okay? And the people are very good about going, no, that wasn't real good. And before we actually start the show, Office Hours, when we're in the pre-show and we're all trying to get set up, people also will be happy to ask questions. So for right now, it's a mentoring thing. It's ask the community, find out what you need to do.
Great. Jason.
My answer is not yet, but Noah, are you volunteering? Do you have any Wikipedia experience? In which case, by all means, please step up.
I love that. All right. It's been a great collaborative learning experience for me, and I think for a lot of people being on Office Hours, because there is behind the scenes, particularly in after hours, all the other hours we're not live on the show. The amount of help you can get from incredibly talented people who have gone through a lot of this is just stunning. So it's been a great thing to be involved with. Let's move on to the next question.
Marty Pacetta Jr. from Los Angeles asked the question, love the idea of using a teleprompter for eyeline. I lead a ton of Zoom production meetings, and the idea of having the ability to put Zoom meetings and teleprompter switching to notes and such is pretty cool. Do you guys have any favorites?
Let's go to David Paskin first, then Noah Sargent. David, go ahead.
Sure. So I'm using a teleprompter here for my Zoom meetings, and it is absolutely a game changer. I personally use the TMP100 from Glide Gear with a Lilliput 10-inch screen. As I get older and the text gets smaller on people's names, it's not the biggest screen, but it's absolutely budget friendly. So that's what I would recommend.
Really nice. Noah.
Yeah, I started with a 12-inch prompter from Prompter People, but did some reviews for them, and I also shoot corporate videos, and so I actually own 2 of the 24-inch prompters, and I would definitely highly recommend those. They are a little expensive; they're close to like $3,000, but if you're booking them and using them for work as well as what we do here, it's definitely worth having.
And we're moving to Mitchell Hill.
Yeah, I looked at some of your early videos there on that, Noah. Good job. By the way, I'm still shopping for the teleprompter that's going to be perfect for me. I'm kind of bouncing between the Prompter Pro. They have a ProFlex 24 with a swing arm on it, which would mount nicely to my desk, or the Glide Gear going with the smaller ones. So, Noah, your point of being careful to anticipate, what is it, buy once, cry once, makes a lot of sense to me.
Rupert.
The question is,
So, oh, I thought it was
Jeffrey.
next.
No, it was Rupert now. Oh, I'm sorry. Jeffrey Powers was next in the line. Boy, this is moving around for me. Jeffrey, you go ahead, then we'll do Rupert. No, it's all right.
So anyway, to me, I'm gonna go for the smaller one, because the one thing when it comes to a Zoom meeting that you want on the screen is the person video. Instead of having the gallery, you want to have that 2-screen experience where, like right now, I can see Bill in the second screen. I want those eyes right in the middle, so when I'm looking at that little black void, which I'm not because I got a teleprompter in front of me, it looks like I'm looking at you and you're looking at me, which is why we're starting to do a whole bunch of framing inside of office hours. You notice that all of us have our heads almost in the exact spot where it needs to be, so lower thirds can be done and all that stuff. You probably don't have to worry about that, but at least you're keeping that eye contact. If you put a whole bunch of stuff on your screen, like I have on, because I have a back end prompter, which is basically a big monitor in front of the camera, if I look up here, you're going to start to see that if it's not in the center, that you'll see the eyes kind of wander around. So it's very important to have that central focus. So a smaller monitor will help you do that.
Rupert McRae.
So the question mentions switching to notes. I've actually had quite good luck with having my Zoom window up or whatever, and then having a notes application overlaid and have the background on that application set to basically transparent, so I can overlay my notes over my Zoom view, which works quite nicely.
Yeah, and for me, in the era of Zoom, this has become more normal, which is somebody looking out of whatever monitor I'm watching directly at me. For a long time, when I was shooting interviews, I was back and forth. There's sometimes when I want that direct connection intimacy. There's sometimes, particularly in interviews with subjects that are dealing with difficult issues, it can get a little invasive to me. So I like using both styles, a direct gaze, which the teleprompter or the Interatron, Errol Morris's old idea of changing from only looking on to a direct connection between who's speaking to you on the TV. Sometimes the tonality of the interview determines for me that now I really kind of want to observe a little bit from the side, particularly if there's going to be some really deep emotional content, because some people are actually made uncomfortable by that. You know, you just want to walk away from somebody who's breaking down and having difficulty. But that's the art of all of what we do. There's never just one solution, and if you always do it this way, you've got it perfect. There's a lot of variation to this. Let's move on. Next question.
This is from our friend Eduardo Augustine at Panama. What is the dress code for your production staff? Black shirt, small logo on the front, white shirt, big logo on the back. Any suggestion?
Jason Bache is going to handle it first.
All right, I'm going to defer to the Mickey. It depends, but less than you would think it depends. I have brought crews in on set, and I think Alex is the only other person I've ever heard to say this, but I have required suits. That is not the most common thing. It is very hard to go wrong with no logos whatsoever and production grays. So that balanced, neutral gray. And if, it's a stage production, I would say flat black. But again, there's no harm in asking. If you haven't done it before, grays or blacks.
Noah Sargent.
That's a great point. Yeah, I like the standard black look across the board. And so I do a lot of corporate communication events. And so we've switched to kind of the Blackmagic Design look, where it's a long sleeve dress shirt, right, with the logo. And so you can kind of see it behind me, but I have a stack of about 35 shirts with my company logo. And so what I do is I'll ask everybody ahead of time what size they are. I'll bring shirts to set and have our team wear the same outfit. Which sounds kind of controlling, but the reality is if you have that uniform look, you kind of command that confidence in that corporate environment. And I think people have really paid attention to that, and it kind of gives us some kudos, so to speak.
Yeah, it's also nice when people know, oh, you're with the production team. I can ask you to ask somebody a question, so that helps communication. Jeffrey Powers, your thoughts?
Yeah, I have polo shirts for any crew that I have that have my Geekazine logo on the breast there, and I've also been a fan of long long sleeve shirts, because there's always something about if you have the ability to rolling up your shirts, like you're getting into the task at hand and going from there. Otherwise, if a lot of pit work that I've ever done has always been black shirts, and not to do button down, try and keep it as short as possible, thin to the skin, so you don't get it in the way when you're playing.
And finally, someone named Alex Lindsay wants to weigh in on this.
Yeah, so I mean, usually as a producer, usually what I try to do is dress like one step below my client, and so that's I look at what they're wearing and I wear a little bit less. I will say that you want to think about not just what they notice or what they talk about, but how they feel about it, and you want to think about how that's going to look. A lot of times people can kind of cobble together something, and it is people make decisions about how refined your production is oftentimes, and whether they should or not, by how you dress and how you present yourself. And so you want to really kind of think through that. We generally wear black-ish stuff on set, but usually things that look at all worn or over washed, a little faded, we tend to move away from. Tend not to wear tennis shoes unless we're loading in, and then and so the one thing that we did learn is if you give everybody names with little plaques and you dress in suits, everyone will think you're catering. so you have to be careful of that you don't blend in too much.
All right, are you going to grab the con?
Yeah,
here?
I'll grab it. Go ahead, Noah. Go ahead, take it away.
Oh, sure. I was just going to mention, just on a personal note, shoes are highly important, especially orthopedics or something, if you're standing all day working on your feet.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's jump to the next question.
Jason Robertshaw from Sarasota, Florida wants to know, who does your makeup? Do you bother touching up your appearance for live events? Recommendations for how to lightly improve the appearance of hosts and guests. Where to find makeup for men?
Go ahead, Jason.
Okay. At the end of the day, thank you. I know it's, I was born with it, I suppose. But no, at the end of the day, if somebody doesn't have a makeup person, in general, I've asked my girlfriend to do it in the past. These are really great to have around, these oil-absorbing strips. I know Alex swears by some sort of clear something from MAC, because especially for men, if you're not going to touch up under the eyes, a lot of the time you'll end up with a hot point on your forehead, and it's not because you actually appear oily, but anytime you put bright lights on you, you can just look a little bit shiny. So no wrong answer here. The answer is, unlike stage makeup, actually kind of like stage makeup, it's designed to not look like makeup, and anyone with a light touch can do that for you.
And I use what you're talking about here is this MAC. It is called matte, I think, and it's really hard to find. So, and this one's almost out, and I'll show it to you how it works. So this is all we've used for maybe over a decade. We expect other people to, if you want makeup, we expect you to come with it. Or on big events, we'll hire hair and makeup for everybody to work through. But for a general interview, as people come through, especially with men, they're not going to want you to put powder on and all the other things for the most part. So we use this. This is, you can see my forehead. You can see this kind of high thing. Now, if I just put this on, you'll see how that just goes away. So that highlight that I had on my forehead and my nose and my cheeks just kind of get diffused. So that's a lot of us carry these around in our bag for other people, generally, not for us. Anyway, so that's what we use. Bill?
Yeah, I've been around theater for such a long time that makeup was pretty normal even when I was growing up, if you were going to present or do something on camera. My wife was in local TV for a long time, and she talked me through the transition from regular standard definition makeup to new makeup that came in the high definition era, because it really is different. Some of the techniques and the things that people used back in the old days just don't work with these new high definition cameras and so forth. I will also say one other thing we did when we built our studios, we made sure that the makeup area could be isolated. And the reason was we were working with a lot of CEOs and high-level corporate executives, and you do not want to put them in a makeup chair when their people are watching. Yeah. It is a very subtle thing, but it kind of diminishes them in some, maybe just inside their own head, and you don't want them to feel uncomfortable ever.
Noah?
You definitely don't need to overdo it, but I would encourage you to lean into the fact that it's a tool of the trade, right? Something that we can use to help make the image better, right? Our skin better, so to speak. And so I think by default, sometimes we could be intimidated by that process, but it's actually something that could be very helpful. And obviously for males, the stereotypical thing is to use less of it, which I would highly encourage. And as someone who is an assistant director, obviously you want to build out more time for ladies compared to men, generally speaking. But yeah.
Go ahead, Lois.
So in the old days, back in the 90s on the television shows, we had cameras that required a lot of light in order to work. So the stage was bright. I mean, bright. And your face was totally washed out. So you had to wear stage makeup. You had to put enough light, color, whatever. That changed as soon as the cameras got so that we didn't have to be overheated on the set. We just had normal lights. Today, you have people coming in from all different venues and walks. And looking here at our panelists on the Zoom show, if you look at the panelists, you'll see a lot of different looks. And the looks that I think is important when you're producing a show is that you have makeup that is appropriate to everyone or no one, so that you don't have someone who is got lots of stuff on right next to someone who is plain, unless that's the style that they personally have, so that you don't have anyone looking out of place if you have a group on your show.
Yep.
As far as what Alex is using on his forehead, we just used cornstarch. It worked really well.
Next question.
Sorry. Noah Sargent from Fullerton, California asks, when should we expect the next Blackmagic Design event? Still holding out for the MixFX 2 upgrade, but may have to pick up the Constellation.
I think the Constellation is probably a good investment. I don't think it's going anywhere. I don't think they're gonna. I think that's got legs. It's quite a machine. I do think there's updates that we feel like are coming between the Extremes and the Constellation that we haven't seen. So that's what we're kind of waiting to see what happens. I feel like in the next couple of weeks, maybe in January, that we might see something. I don't have any information, so it's just a matter of guessing from the tea leaves that, wow, there's a huge open gap. The other big open gap is a camera that's able to do 8K, because you have an 8K switcher, 8K recorders, 8K, all kinds of other things, and you don't have a camera that can do that. It seems like something's out of whack there. Now, next question.
Eduardo Augustine from Panama wants to know which software device is used for the office hour mic check.
Go ahead, Jason. Can't hear you, Jason.
Sorry, it does help, but I bet my sync was perfect.
Yeah.
I don't remember the name. Sorry, I'm blanking.
Yeah, we're using WLM meters is what we're using for the mic check, and that is, I think that's being used. I mean, it can be used inside of a lot of things. It's a plug-in, so it's not a standalone. At least the one that we're using. So our mic check is WLM meters, and it sits, I believe, inside of Audio Hijack, but it can also sit in Pro Tools or other things that it just meters out for you. Next question.
Paul Valhus of Austin, Texas. What is the sweet spot for USB thumb drives? Best price for most capacity?
Go ahead, Jason.
I'm going to give you a better answer than a concrete one, Paul. The way that you measure this cost curve, this kind of economies of scale, is by setting cost per gigabyte. I do this all the time with SSDs, and it is constantly changing. More importantly than cost per gigabyte is, for me at least, dexterity, how long it lasts on my keychain sometimes, and what sustained throughput is. So I'll put it through a Blackmagic torture test or two, put a sustained write. I have a standard 50 gigabyte file that I will drop onto a jump drive and just stopwatch it. And at the end of the day, that's going to be as good an indication as any.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
I'm a big fan of SanDisk when it comes to thumb drives, but I also want to warn you that if you're going to use this for a long-term solution, you're going to plug it into a computer and leave it in. Don't do that with USB drives. They overheat, and that can always cause corruption of your files. That can always cause the fact of the thumb drive to stop working. The better thing to do would be to get an SSD solution with a cord so it can handle the heat dispersion a little bit better. But like I said, SanDisk is what I normally go for a USB drive.
Go ahead, Bill.
And file sizes are getting bigger, particularly if you work in video or audio. These new digitization schemes sometimes produce really big files, so that the size of thumb drives that I used in my early days are useless now, and I try to buy the biggest I can and the fastest I can.
Yeah, I usually get somewhere between 256 and 512 because I don't want them to be big. Like I don't want them to get too big because I use them as transfer, and I try to keep in my head that this is not something I'm going to store a bunch of stuff on. This is something I'm going to hand a file to someone. Next question.
Craig Kadoki in Toronto, California, with the panoramic modes on the DJI Osmo, is there a workflow to use it with Polycam?
Go ahead, Jason.
Get out of my head. I tried that actually, and I thought, man, I'm going to have the world's greatest USDZ when I'm done with this. And no, the panorama is designed for panoramic pictures. Really what you need is even dot spread. So I have had some luck with just holding it while I'm using these 3D apps. But again, like it is designed for a wobbly hand.
Yeah, so there's two things there. One is that if you don't have LiDAR, essentially what it needs is known vanishing points. When you do a panorama, it's mixing and matching a bunch of photos, and that's actually the hardest thing for it to possibly digitize. So a panorama mode is probably the worst thing to use. Now you can use something like a theta, which will capture a sphere, and it's a known lens with a known focal, and it's if you capture multiple thetas, there's some programs that will let you take those spheres and turn them into 3D models. It's still better to move the camera around. Panoramas mean that the nodal point isn't moving very much within the camera. And the problem with that is that it doesn't create the parallax that's necessary to figure out where that camera was. So really where you want the camera to be moving around it. You want basically what you're shooting to be overlapped, but also you want it to be overlapped, but also from a different angle so that it can see those same points as it works through the photogrammetry. So the LiDAR, which is the structured light, is telling it exactly where it is if you have that. And then the photogrammetry is matching, first it matches 2D details, and then it uses those 2D details to build where the cameras are, and from there it generates the geometry. Next question.
Eduardo Augustine at Panama, randomly programmed from the ATEM Mini through USB-C, USB-A, tends to flicker in the bottom half. It seems it could be a USB driver issue, but this only happened after upgrading to version 8.6.4. His question is there any specific way to solve this?
Go ahead, Jason.
My immediate thought is that correlation is not causation. It is possible, but highly unlikely that was the issue. My immediate thought would be you didn't actually uninstall the ATEM software before reinstalling the new one. So be sure you remove it, reboot, and then reinstall it. And just for safety, reboot again, then plug your ATEM in and see if you still have the issue.
Next question.
This is from David Brady in New York City. And while logged into my Zoom account, my display name is an office hours standard, name, local, ID. However, when I jump into after hours, it is only my name. Things are set in the Zoom profile, but why the difference?
I actually have no idea. I don't know why it would present. Oh, because you're registered differently between the two. So when you go into after hours, you registered it's the same account, but whatever you typed in when you registered to the webinar is different than what you typed in when you registered to the meeting, and that's why you're showing up differently. Next question.
From TJ Asher in Minneapolis, Minnesota, can David Paskin give a brief demo of how he does the text picture overlay?
Go ahead, David.
Sure. So I am using Keynote on a separate computer, which I just put a green screen background on, and then I add whatever overlays I want, and then I bring that in through a capture card into my streaming computer through Ecamm Live. So, which means if I just turn that green screen on, you get the overlays just like that.
That's great. Thanks, David. Next question.
Question from Noah Sargent in Fullerton, California. If a 64-key Stream Deck was released, would you buy it, and how many?
I go at Ari.
Yes, maybe. Yes, definitely. Let me explain. The answer is yes, I would, but I wouldn't always use it. how do I look at it? I'm constantly running out, well, not constantly, but you may, in the case if you run out of buttons in a production, the last thing that I want is to switch to a different page on Stream Deck or to a different page on Companion, or both, or go into a folder. Every single button pressed that I can save is one less chance for a mistake and time saved on the show. So if the entire show, including all graphics, switching, routing, and whatnot, fits on that single surface, yes, I would want it. If in that 64 button configuration I would find myself that I'd have to move to a different page, I would want 232s where I could stay on one and move on the other. So I see a use case for both, and I would buy it just because I like colorful buttons and lots of them.
I go with Josh.
Yeah, good answer. I'd be similarly interested in it. One interesting aspect to it is the use of bit focus. So typically you can map in a grid view, so the zoom windows, but the problem is the vertical aspect. So I assume like an 8x8, currently there's plenty of space for the horizontal, but if there was more vertical, then that might be helpful for the grid view.
And go ahead, Jeffrey.
So the one thing that that 64 buttons doesn't give you is the fact that you can control it with one hand. That's what I like about the Stream Deck. You can put it on your desk. You can control it with your hand. 32 buttons is perfect. If I want to add anything, it'd be a jog wheel or a fade or anything like that. If they want to make a 64 button anything, I'd rather see a 64 button keyboard. That way I can put it to my regular QWERTY keys, or I can actually change it to something else. Or then if I call up Photoshop or any type of stream, I can use those keys with the functions like that.
Let's go to the next question.
This is from Greg Switch in Swick in Irwin, Pennsylvania, looking for ideas for decorative sound panels.
I go with Jesse.
Tons of options out there, I guess. Depends on your budget. Of course, you can make your own panels. There's a cool company called Gilliford of Maine that makes both panels and fabric material, and they actually rate their materials with different acoustic absorption with a chart that covers the frequency range. So you might look into that. And I guess if you're looking for architectural or something like that, there's Architectura. If you're designing an office or something that's like a Google or a Facebook type of thing. But wide range, and of course you can make your own out of rock wool or something like that if you're not really trying to get fancy.
Go ahead, Noah.
I also had the DIY in mind, and so one of the ideas I had, if you had several panels on a wall, you could basically put them all together and do like the Jackson Pollock method, splatter some paint on it, and that can match your branding or colors depending on what you want there.
Good, Bill.
If you want to keep it really, really cheap, there's a classical material. It's called Owens Corning 703. I've seen it in studios for decades. It is a kind of a golden colored insulation. What people do is build a little frame, put up some of that 703, and then you can use any kind of fabric you want over it. Depending, it's more absorbent than it is diffusion. So it's not like the convoluted surface things that help with diffusing high frequencies, but it can do some moderate stopping of echoes and things like that. We used to see 703 even in the big studios around where I was growing up.
Next question.
Daniel McFarlane from Belfast, Northern Ireland. I'm seeing issues with drop frames while outputting to a Blackmagic Ultrastudio from Black Syphon on a base M1 Mac Mini. Have there been any similar issues with Office Hours 2.0?
Go, Jason.
No, because we use a different framework. We use the Duo 2. I don't think that's a state secret, but no, I don't think there's been any issues on the 2.0 side.
We have had some black frames, but I'm not sure if they're connected to. We definitely have some black frame issues, but I'm not sure if it's connected to the output, a pure output. Remember that our Mac Minis are putting out 4 1080p streams at a time into the system, so I'm not certain that it's connected there. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael. The popular piano keyboard game Synthesia says 61 key keyboards will feel limited, and you will find some songs where you can only reach all the notes for one hand at a time. To develop keyboard skills for electronic music, would 61 keys be enough?
Go ahead, Michael.
Sure, 61 keys is going to be fine. You won't need anything bigger for electronic music. You can most of the controller keyboards, if not all, have a transpose button. So you can transpose and then put in an octave. If you're trying to do octave bass in the left hand, you can do that. Another option for you is to record it in the bass into your DAW, and then copy the track down and transpose it down an octave. So you're going to be fine with the 61 key keyboard, no problem at all.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, I totally agree. 88 keys is the standard for a concert piano. So, and you need to have there is music that's written that needs the whole 88 keys. But once again, like Michael said, you can always drop down an octave. You can also get a second keyboard, a smaller keyboard that's a single octave to cover that missing one.
Let's jump to the next question.
Andre Dalla from Berlin wants to know, how do people screenscape? Which software is cost-effective and reliable? Any other hints?
Go ahead, Ari.
NDI screen capture has worked just fine for me.
Go ahead, John.
He didn't say Mac or PC, so I'm going to show you all of the above, and I'll go fast. I use OBS for screen capture. This is done on OBS for live stuff, and then for screen captures for recorded stuff, I use ScreenFlow on the Mac, and then for the PC, I use Camtasia. So OBS on PC and Mac for live, and then for recorded stuff, I use Camtasia and or ScreenFlow.
And for me, a lot of times I'm using some kind of HDMI output and capturing either 4K or 1080p from an external device. So like for 1080p, which is mostly what I'm doing for screen captures, unless I'm in a Zoom, I still have an old Pix 240. The reason for that is that it takes puts a lot less pressure on the CPU. So if I'm doing something with heavy graphics or video playback, I have a tendency to lose less frames when I do that. Next question.
Sarah Doyle from Falls Church, Virginia asks, getting a Mac Mini to host a Unity server, do I actually need the M1?
Go ahead, Jason.
No, Sarah, you totally don't. But you really should get one anyway.
Yeah, the M1 is probably overkill for what you're doing. The Unity server requires very, very little CPU power to work, and we have older Mac Minis that we've had running the Unity server without any issue at all. So you could probably get away even with a used one that is years old, and it would probably work fine. But to what Jason said, if you're going to get a computer, you may want to use it for something else later. I'd be hard pressed to invest in Intel at this point on the Mac. Next question.
Jesse Mills from the San Francisco Bay Area asks, looking for an affordable PT head for a Panasonic BHG1 that can be network controlled.
eGrip makes ones that are kind of in the middle. So there's very affordable ones that just don't pan very well. And then there's the eGrip is probably the ones, they're probably in a couple $1,000 range, but I haven't seen anything that pans smoothly under a few $1,000s as far as the control goes. Once you get under that, the motors are there. Now that may be fine. When we use PTZs, a lot of the time we're not trying to follow someone in the front. We're trying to cut. I just need the frame that I'm getting into. If I want to follow someone, I'm going to use a person in a camera. So it just depends on what you're trying to get out of that. But I think that, again, eGrip, also Rushworks is another one that makes relatively cost-effective ones. But neither of them, well, eGrip, we can do pans. Rushworks, I probably wouldn't. The motors aren't precise enough. Next question.
This is from Craig McFarlane from Boston. The original HDMI cable protocol had an emphasis on content protection to prevent duplication. Did this go away, or does everything bypass it?
Go ahead, Jason.
Great question, Craig. Turns out to be exactly the opposite. Cable manufacturers figured out that they had to be compliant for HDCP, and that has never been more true than now. People will return them and burn them or cut them up and write one-star reviews if it doesn't work between my insert thing here to insert thing here.
Go ahead, Bill.
Also, HDMI, and I'm going to pass on it.
Yeah, the hard part is they had to build a format, and they couldn't change it because there was so much standards. And so there's definitely, when you pay less money for your converters, is when you actually tends to do the HTTP handshake but then doesn't pass it all the way down. So so that's usually where we've found that the cheaper Chinese knockoffs tend to not pass the HDCP protection down the chain. Next question.
Fred Kadoki from Toronto, Canada. Has anyone used the JK Audio Blue Set adapters with FreeSpeak 2 systems, preferably with an Aftershock? How was the experience?
We haven't used them with the FreeSpeak. We've definitely used them in the past, and this is we've used Bluetooth connections where we're putting. I assume what you're talking about is the JK audio that you put into the headset jack, and then it will connect to a Bluetooth receiver and let you use a headset that's wireless from the pack. And those have been relatively successful. They say 75 feet. We don't take them more than 20. so they, they're pretty optimistic about their range. But definitely within a room, they're really nice to be able to just kind of pass that around. Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, actually, I'm looking to use it with, like I said, the Aftershokz with actually a FreeSpeak wireless belt pack, mostly just because the Aftershokz really appeal to me. Right. So I still have open ears and I can hear what's going on around me on stage.
Yeah, but they definitely have. I mean, we've worked with them. Now, we've used ones that are closed systems. So they have ones that basically are the transmitter and the receiver, and they're using a different Bluetooth protocol for that that's higher quality and larger range. So that you want to take a look at that as well. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael. Could an Office Hours 2.0-like active performer smart system streamline live concert video support, i.e. using optical sensors on mic stands or some sort of sensing to determine the performer to highlight at any given time?
Good, Bill.
Could it versus should it? It probably could. You probably could rig up something where the person who starts singing got switched to automatically. But part of the art of any kind of visual presentation is knowing when to follow the marching band drummer and when to exit from that. If you're just saying when you open your mouth and start singing, that becomes the shot, then you take away that piece of artistic brilliance that it makes jazz what it is. And if you go back and listen to even early, hugely popular jazz singers, and I'm classifying Frank Sinatra in that, listen to some of his early recordings, he's hardly ever on the beat. He lags, he proceeds, and that makes some of the magic in his performances. In the same way, a really good switcher will understand when to cut a little ahead of something, give you time to get used to the scene before it starts, or will lag a little to let you keep on a reaction to something before you go on there. So could it? Yes. Should it? Probably not.
If you even just look at the auto switching for Zoom, it's fine. It's not great. That's why we have lowest cutting. so the thing is that and that is all of us coming through at shoulder and head level, not a concert with smoke and everything else. And so the chances of a computer doing it well when it can't even do auto switching extremely well would probably be low, at least in the near future. Next question.
Panelist Guy Cochran from Seattle, USA. If we had a retro gear day, what would you bring?
A retro gear day. Ari?
Sorry, I don't know if this is considered retro or gear.
One, and we're going to go pretty fast through it because we're at the end of the hour. Go ahead.
All right, this is my Fluke, which I've had for over 30 years, and that's what I bring.
Nice. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Depends on what we're calling retro. It could be last year, or it could be retro. But I would go for microphones. I'd pull some of my older dynamic microphones out of it. Of course, all my panel lights are probably considered retro right now.
Yeah. Go ahead, John.
I've got this coming and a Fisher Price camera.
Hey, we're going to come see you later. Go ahead, Josh.
Well, like Jeffrey said, it depends on what you consider retro. I might just pull up some of my previous audio and video chain gear.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I too had to settle on how retro. And, I ended up with, let's see, this would be S-Video Out from a really old Samsung.
Go ahead, Michael Drost. Michael?
I would go with all the old microphones like Jeffrey was talking about. And then, of course, if I had my choice, I would bring the entire Abbey Road studios with all their equipment. And that would be it.
Go ahead, Bill.
In my Office Hours 2.0 back set, you will eventually see an ancient wire recorder from the I think it's the 1910s or 20s that even has an Art Deco little crazy microphone with it. That's my crown jewel of old tech still working.
I think that for me, I have a somewhere somewhere in my garage. I have a Sony F950, which was used on Star Wars. I think that's my best retro tool. Next question.
This is from Eduardo Augustine in Panama. I use Scarlett Pre-AMS DAC and input audio to PC, thinking in shifting to adding all audio to ATEM Mini and not use Scarlett when not using mics. Question, what's best practice? Should I input all audio to ATEM?
Go ahead, Jason.
Not using Scarletts when not using mics is going to work independently of any of this. I'll answer the question that I think you meant. Should I not use my Scarlett? And the answer is, as long as you've got a high enough quality camera to put your audio in a way that is reliable, sure.
Next question.
From Jesse Mills in the San Francisco Bay Area, is there a catalog of switch profiles, configurations for popular AV over IP switches like Ubiquiti, Cisco, Draytech, and others?
I go ahead, Jason.
No, there isn't, but Office Hours is really, really good at this. A whole handful of us can walk you through and get you what you need.
And I think we really buzzed through a lot of questions here. I think we have one more for the first hour here. So let's go ahead and jump into that. I'm not sure if I understand what it is.
From A. Mitchells in Washington, does anyone know about the most recurrent news about Clyde? What's going on with Clyde? Thanks.
Does anyone know what that is? Okay, we went through it. It was kind of at the bottom of the questions there because I wasn't sure exactly what that meant. So since no one's raised their hand, we don't know. All right. We have maybe room for one more question if someone throws it in there. We're running just to the very top of the hour. We're gonna bring in Michael Krasny here. Just 1 second here.
I'm really looking forward to this. This should be a fascinating second hour.
Yeah, a lot of questions are stacking up. So
yeah, he's an excellent host.
Yeah. So we're very excited. Okay, stand by. We're going to bring Michael in. Michael, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Great. Can you just say a couple words for us? We didn't get a mic check in. We just wanted, before we start the second hour, we just want to make sure your levels are okay.
Yeah. Just sitting here and ready for the show.
Okay, great.
A few more words if you need them.
Yeah, no, that's it. That's perfect. No, we're going to leave that just the way it is. So, all right. We're now changing our direction and moving towards our second hour here. And I'd like to introduce, it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce Michael Krasny. Michael Krasny, for over 25 years, was the host for KQED's forum until February of this year, as well as hosting. He did host around, not only hosting that forum, but also hosting events around the world, doing interviews and master of ceremonies. In addition to that, he is a professor of English at San Francisco State University and an author. The thing that's interesting, and one of the things that I've been the most excited about here, is that I listened to Michael Krasny for over 20 years. So I got here in 1996 in California, and my morning drives were oftentimes timed around forum. So I actually, like when, I was like, oh, I now have something I can listen to that I'm going to enjoy. And I just always loved the format. And the secret is that our second hour is largely based on that. So the idea of opening up a little bit of Q&A and then bringing people in, is something that we've really taken on for that. And so it's, so anyway, we're really excited to have you, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So I'll kick it off. We have a lot of questions that have already stacked up. So I'll keep it pretty quick as far as getting off the ground here before we hand it off to the audience. But I wanted to know, how did you get started in radio? Was that your first? Did you leave college into radio, or did you do a couple things before that?
No, I took a course in radio in high school. It was sort of useless. I wanted to use my voice, and I was able to come over the loudspeakers to homerooms and things of that sort. But I became a professor and a scholar, and always, I guess, had a hankering to do something with my voice, which is getting a little ragged now as I age. So kind of restlessness took me to a little station in Marin County where I live and where actually Alex lives. It was what you would call non-commercial and highly unusual radio. I was telling Alex about how the first time I walked in, I saw the Plasmatics, and they had a reggae show. I got to meet Bob Marley. There were a lot of exciting, fun things going on. But for the most part, I wanted to do a show that was serious-minded and that could interview a lot of celebrities who lived in Marin, and it was a combination of those two things. And then I found myself moving into commercial radio. They kind of discovered me, and I worked for ABC for a number of years. And that was an okay fit, but a better fit was public radio. And I moved into public radio in 1993 and kept my teaching job and kept writing. And so I was juggling three sort of careers at once.
Well, and how do you approach an interview when you have someone that's going to join you for Forum? How did you, for 25 years, how did you, or over 25 years, how did you actually approach preparing for that interview?
Well, there's no secret to the way you approach an interview. I tell students and anybody who asks, you just have to be as prepared as you possibly can be. You have to also learn how to listen and build up as much as you can a kind of rapport with whomever you're talking about. But that can come from learning a great deal about who that person is and what they've done, and getting the content of their work and their lives as much as you can. When I interviewed politicians, I had a whole different role. I wanted to be more of a barracuda and ask the tough questions. But for the most part, there are kind of teaching skills and jazz-like skills involved. You have to improvise, and you have to make sure that you move things along. But at the same time, you want to make the person as available to his or her, or now we'd say their content as possible, and make them not necessarily look good, but at least avail them of the opportunity to enlighten and to illuminate. And to some extent, that means asking good questions and asking the right kinds of questions. And so preparation is key. And I had a wonderful team of producers, and they fed me a lot. I was sort of like a black hole, just absorbing things all the time. And I came in to interview people or to interview panelists, or I did a lot in the private sector with CEOs and so forth, and a lot of on-stage interviews, just as possible, completely, totally as prepared as I could be.
And how is the role as the interviewer and as the host of the show? How do you interact with your producers for these shows?
Actually, you're doing a good job interviewing here, Alex. But I'm sorry. The question is, how do you get involved with the person you're interviewing?
How do you, when you're working with your producers that are planning the shows, what is the interaction? I mean, how much work do they do? How much are they handing you? How much do you have to do yourself during the show? Do you have any interaction with the producers that you're working with for Forum?
Well, my producers would feed me. They would give me information. They would give me links. And then I would go and do sort of spade work on my own, enhancing that. And yes, while I'm on the air, they're giving me information also, especially if there's breaking news or anything along those lines. Right. There was always a connection to the newsroom. And so we tried to be on top of the news. And in some instances, we literally broke news live on the air. It was always very exciting and challenging. The producers would also text me while I was on the air. They would feed me information that was coming in from the listeners. And the listeners, like your format, as you said, would be asking questions by texting or by emailing or tweeting. And to a great extent, it was just a matter of integrating all of those things. Right. It sounds a little bit easier when I characterize it the way I'm doing to you than it was, because you're sort of juggling a lot of things at once. But the producers play a key role and an instrumental role in making the show launch and making the show get it moving in the different directions it can be.
Yeah, one of the things that I find the most challenging about interviews is for the host is really when to try to pull something out of somebody and when to cut them off. You know, when someone asks me how to be host, you got to decide. Someone's not giving you enough information. You're gonna ask questions to pull it out, or they're talking too much, and you have to figure out where to to head them off so that you can move the conversation forward. How do you approach that dance with your interviewees?
It's a question that's often asked, and there aren't any pat or facile answers to that. I think, again, if you're listening and if you're keyed into the person you're talking to or the people you're talking to, there are certain moments where you can, I mean, sometimes you just have to interrupt. There are people who think they're doing filibusters, and they have a strong case that they want to make, and they go on with a kind of loquacity that is almost intolerable. So you have to really jump a lot of times and move the conversation, not impolitely, but through some sort of transitional method. I think of it like being a bat. I feel my radar is there, and I'm following my curiosity all the time, and I'm listening. But at the same time, I have to give deference to the fact that people need to be interrupted. I need to move transitionally to other types of content that is in front of me or that is in my head, or that I'm piqued by my curiosity. And that's always a very sort of tender game that you're playing to make sure that you're not being rude at the same and being civil. Although sometimes it's okay to be more aggressive, particularly with politicians, I think, because they can ramble on and they're, well, seriously, I mean, they're just there to do their hyping. Or you have people, sometimes I'd interview an author, and I realized this early on in my career, and the author would have certain talking points. So it didn't matter what question I asked. The author wanted to steer things toward the talking point that they felt would enhance their book or make people want to buy their book. And there are ways that you, again, through listening and through sort of orchestrating things, that you move away from that kind of domination. There are interviews where you just have to interrupt people because they're doing things that, again, you have to sense are not necessarily in the best interest of your listeners or you.
Absolutely. We have so many questions coming in. I'm gonna jump to them in just a second. But one question I want to ask are, what are some of the most interesting moments that you've had in all of the 30 years that you've been doing this of interviews that really stick out for you?
I like the way you frame that question, because too often people say, who is your best or most interesting interview? And there were thousands of interviews, both on and off the air. So it's very hard to make that kind of selection, and it would insult too many people.
Right.
But you use the word interesting, which is an interesting word in itself. I mean, I've had some moments that were very difficult. I think I told Alex a story about interviewing Jerry Garcia. Now there's a movie being made about Jerry Garcia, but when I had the opportunity to interview him, he decided in the midst of the interview to take out a little spoon and put cocaine in his nose. And that was certainly something that I guess you could describe as very interesting.
Not what you expected.
I got a little freaked out by it because it was pre-internet and there were deadheads outside, hordes of them. Somehow they got word through their own communication channels. It's like something out of Thomas Pynchon. And I said, go to a public service announcement. Mr. Garcia, I'm sorry, you can't do that in here. And he was actually very nice and sweet. And he said, you can't? Okay. And he put the spoon away and we went on with the interview. So there are moments like that. I'll tell you a quick story about, I was doing a multicast with Channel 7 here, the ABC TV channel, when I was on radio. And I write about this in a book called Off Mic that Stanford Press published. And I had someone on named Ken Edelman, who some of you may remember was in the Bush administration, had the ambassador rank. And Dan Quayle, we had breaking news. Dan Quayle was announced as the running mate for George Bush Sr. And I said, some of these are just anecdotal, but these are pretty interesting moments, to put it mildly, in response to your question, Alex. I said to Ken Edelman, I said, I don't mean to be unkind, but Dan Quayle doesn't seem to be terribly bright. It seems to be, a little bit short of gray matter. And Edelman answered that question forthrightly, I thought. He said, he's much smarter than people realize. He's just not that articulate. He's done nuclear negotiations and so forth. And then we had to go to an advertisement. We were off the air. This is, like I said, multicast, TV and radio. And I said, I'm sorry if you were offended by that question, but Quayle just seems like kind of a dim bulb to me. Whereupon he said, blank you, just like that. I mean, I won't say the F word here. I'm used to censoring those words, being a radio journalist.
Yep.
And I'm kind of a street kid in terms of my background is proletariat. And I just came back and said, blank you. And then suddenly we were on the air, and I said, "And now, Ambassador, what do you think?" I mean, there's a lot of sort of instruction and allegory in that story. What you do sometimes is you just go on with the show,
Right.
even though something like that happens. You know, there are all those kinds of stories through many years of broadcasting, but I was very moved and certainly in many ways inspired by many of the people I interviewed. I had a great privilege of interviewing some of the newsmakers, greatest newsmakers and leaders of our time. And, you know, there's many stories to tell there.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a bunch of questions coming in. Our most popular question is similar to the one that I asked, but I don't think exactly the same. This is from Jasmine Lee in Singapore. What advice do you have for someone preparing to be interviewed? Okay, it's different actually, interviewed. So if someone's getting ready to be interviewed, what's your advice?
My advice is, once again, to be as completely prepared and utterly ready to talk about whatever may be thrown at you. And, you know, that just involves homework. If you've written a book, you know, you want to speak about the book in ways that are going to win not only attention, but also make people aware of the fact that it's an important book, because if you wrote it, it's probably been very important to you in many ways. In other words, just outline what kinds of things you would like to say. Don't necessarily steer the conversation toward those things, but do that in a way that certainly jibes with the questions you're being asked. And sometimes it's just a good idea to stand in front of the mirror and use your voice and feel comfortable with your sense of poise and presence and all of those things that go into doing a good interview and being responsive to whomever is interviewing you and whatever they have to ask.
Yeah, I think probably the two people that we've did a lot of broadcasts, and probably the two people that I thought were the best at that were Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Bill Clinton, in the sense that he had this unnatural ability to pull in whatever you were saying and then wrap whatever he wanted to say into what you just said. You know, like it was, you know, just very contextual. You know, he was good. He was really good at that. Next question is from David Brady in New York. He said, when conducting live interviews, what are some tips of the trade to coax guests back on track when things go sideways?
Well, the best things I think that I can tell you on that score are to stay as high energy as you possibly can, to realize that this is live and you can't necessarily stumble the way you would normally if you were doing editing. People used to say to me frequently, I always listen to you and Terry Gross, and I like you and Terry Gross and so forth, but they're very different kinds of shows, because Terry Gross has, I don't mean this in any derogating way, but she has the advantage, always has the advantage of editing and going over things. When you're doing a live broadcast, you don't have that advantage, and you have to keep that kind of central in your mind. It's going out there and it can't be amended. So if you screw up, you know, that screw up has quite a bit of pain possibly involved in it. And again, I can tell stories and I won't bore you with them, but keep in mind the fact that this is going out live. It's very important to keep that central in your mind, in your whatever cerebellum or medulla oblongata, you know, in your brain, because there's no way of editing. And that can be scary, and that can be also intimidating, and to some extent can be off-putting, but it's also important and central.
Yeah. Grant Whitehead in Adelaide, Australia says, how much did the listener callers redirect the flow of the show?
Depends on the topic. Sometimes if I have a really good topic and I have a lot that I want to ask of a panel or of a politician or an interviewer, again, it's kind of measuring things almost intuitively. You think, is it time to bring listeners in? And your producers can be helpful with this, especially if you've got some really good calls that they're putting in the queue. You have to kind of suss it out and decide, how much time am I going to give to just talking in conversation with this person or with this panel, and when do I go to the callers or when do I go to the listeners? I would do it often. I had the good fortune of having 2 hours on the air, and in each of those hours, I would sort of pack things in the first 20 minutes or the first sometimes 15 minutes, even up to the half hour, and then I'd have a half hour to bring the listeners in and try to move through the listener callers as quickly as possible. And we had faxes in the early days, but then those morphed into.
Did you get a lot of fax questions? Were there a lot of people faxing in the questions?
A lot of people were faxing in the early days when I was in public
great.
radio, or before that at ABC. Yeah, and then technology changed, and so we began to get texts, and we began to get emails, and we began to take, we had a Twitter feed and so forth. So we opened up as much, even took Facebook comments. I mean, as many ways as we could be interactive, we were interactive.
Yeah, absolutely. Grant also asks from Adelaide, Australia. He said, "How did you balance your prepared versus impromptu questions, research versus reaction?"
There's an old saw, Alex, in radio. Actually, one of the old saws is you have to capture people's attention in radio within the first 60 seconds. In TV, you've only got 30 seconds. That's something that I've always borne in mind doing radio and TV for many years. But there's also, and I don't know how much stock you put in these old saws. They used to say you should do 2 hours preparation for every hour you're on the air.
Right.
Well, that depends on what you're doing. I interviewed a lot of novelists and writers because my field was literature. And, I would be spending sometimes a whole weekend engrossed in a tome of a novel. I just did an interview with someone who's Amor Towles, if you know the name, #1 best-selling fiction writer. I did the interview for the Kidney Foundation. And Amor Towles also wrote a wonderful novel about a guy who was trapped in a hotel in Moscow. I mean, very successful writer, and a writer whose work I enjoyed. But the most recent novel of his is a tome, and it takes a lot of time to read a novel and to consider, what's in the novel and to think about it. So it depends on what you're doing and how prepared you are. If I had to stay up with the news constantly, I mean, it was de rigueur for me to just be on top of the news all the time. So I was able to go to that frame of reference and be able to use it as much as possible in impromptu ways. But at the same time, I was always finding the need to prepare. It was almost infinite in some ways. You take a topic like, I've been thinking recently about a lot of things that I've been reading about. For example, I missed being on the air when Afghanistan broke out, or the California recall of Governor Newsom.
Is that hard? Is that hard for you that now that
for my platform? Sorry, Alex. What?
No, I was like, that must be hard for you that you've done that for 25 years and something comes up and you're like, I could interview all these people.
Exactly. And when these news stories occurred, I was in the retirement phase and trying to adjust to retirement. I thought to myself, almost like Pavlov's dogs, I was responding, I've got to get onto researching as much as possible and learning as much as possible beyond what I was reading in the newspapers.
Yeah.
Because for me as a public radio broadcaster, it was always, let's have both sides. Let's hear from different voices, and let's also have me imbued with the idea that there are different sides and different ways of looking at the blackbird, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Adam Mitchells from Washington, D.C. says, when interviewing a high-profile guest, is it better to just let the conversation flow and speak organically off the cuff, or to moderate more heavily to guide the conversation with your questions in a specific direction? And why do you prefer one method or the other?
Well, thank you for all these good questions. You got a lot of smart people in this office hours. I think it's a balance. That's not to be evasive in response to your question, but there are different styles of interviewing. I used to say that, for example, McNeil and Lair believed in the idea of just interviewing and letting the person you're talking to, particularly important or policy-making people, say whatever they needed to say, and not necessarily, you could be like much more absent from the interview.
Right.
Jim Lair told me once that he never, for example, tried to bring his own opinions in or tried to present his ideas. He was a guy who wouldn't even register as a Republican or Democrat because he wanted to show how nonpartisan he was.
Right.
I found sometimes I really needed to bring in an opinion. I had my own subversive ideas of what my opinions ought to be. So sometimes I'd sneak them in, weasel-like and whatnot. I wasn't shy about that, but I also, as a professor, there's a weakness that a lot of us in the teaching world have of wanting to let students know what we think and what our ideas are, not necessarily to proselytize, but to inform and to educate, because we're educators. And there were many instances where I used to think of Charlie Rose as being an example of a guy who always wanted to show off how much learning he had or bring in himself and his own ideas to a great extent. There's a balance for that as far as I'm concerned. You want to let people know you've done your homework, and you want to let people know ideas that are generated, but you don't want to necessarily come off as being smarter than the person you're interviewing. And sometimes you are, frankly, or you're certainly more better informed than the person you're interviewing. I don't
Right.
mean to be flip about this, but that's just a fact, depending who you're interviewing.
Right.
So I like to think of that as a balance, and that's the best answer I can give you.
Yeah. Kyle Hammond in Chicago, Illinois, said, "Can you pinpoint a defining moment that changed the trajectory of your career? And if there's more than one that comes to mind, pick one."
Well, Malcolm Gladwell says the first thing that comes off of your head or to your mind should be paramount and may be much more revelatory than other things. And the first thing that came to my mind was an interview I did years ago with Billy D. Williams. And I know Alex worked on Star Wars, so he may have a familiarity with this particular actor who was, they used to talk about him as the Black Clark Gable. And I always would recoil a little bit when they tried it. It was like calling Marcus Garvey the Black Moses. You had to take somehow a white person and use that white person as the prototype. But he was a very handsome and certainly a very charismatic actor. I came into my interviewing lair for what was called a Black Expo, which was essentially being run by a former student of mine in San Francisco. And it was clear that he didn't want to be in the interview. And he was reticent, and he was answering me in kind of monosyllabic responses. And I took a chance, and I said to him, I said, you seem uncomfortable, and you seem like you don't want to be here. It was the kind of question that maybe Howard Stern would ask, but not necessarily Michael Krasny. But I asked it. And he said, "My mother died just 2 days ago." I mean, it sounds like the beginning of Camus' The Stranger or something, but that was his response. And I thought, well, why are you here? And he said, "I'm here because it's important, Black Expo, and I want to help publicize it and so forth." And then I took a totally different shift, and I said, "Tell me about your mother."
Right.
It was just one of those moments where I knew I was bringing him out in a way because he was still grieving deeply,
Right.
But he wanted to talk about his mother, and he did. And it taught me something about, again, just the jazz-like nature of doing an interview and how compelling it can be sometimes to just be responsive to what the person you're interviewing is saying and how they're behaving.
Absolutely. Juan C. Robles in Mexico asks, "How do you select the topics for an interview?"
Well, it's always tough. And it's always, we would select topics in terms of the forum program that I was hosting, often based on what was paramount in the news or what we felt was important to bring to the public attention of listeners. But when you're doing a single interview or when you're doing an interview of a panel, it's a difficult game of establishing priorities. You think of your audience. What does your audience want to know as best as you can detect that or determine that? And what is it you want to know? I mean, your own curiosity plays a central role here, and you have to trust to some extent that curiosity. Think of yourself as an every person, and think of yourself as someone who, just on the basis of what you prioritize, might be reflecting what other people want to prioritize. But always, again, the balance between what other people want and what you want. Kurt Vonnegut used to say, as advice to writers, write for strangers. And that's good advice in terms of interviewing. You're interviewing someone, but you're interviewing them not necessarily solely for yourself, also for strangers who don't know what you want to know and don't care what you want to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of times I think of it as the host is the advocate for the listeners. Like it is, that's your job, is to pull that out for them. Josh Kaufman.
That is your job. That's absolutely right.
Josh Kaufman from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania asks, "How do you triage research on a guest? Do you read their publications, listen to their past interviews, or reach out to their colleagues? Are there any less thought of sources that you have found helpful in your career?"
I try to learn as much as I can about a guest, and there's certainly a lot online. I do read books. They used to say I would hear through the years, Krasny reads the book of everybody he interviews. That wasn't really true. I would read a few chapters, or I would read an introduction and the last chapter. I would read reviews of the book, things of that sort. I was absorbing a lot,
Well, the hard
doing a
part
lot
is
of
that there's
homework.
so many. When you're doing it every day, there's a lot
Well,
of data.
at one point I was doing 2 hours, 5 days a week, and
Right.
that's 10 hours a week, and sometimes with 3 or 4 authors. Can't read that many books. I mean, it's beyond human capacity to read that many books. But I read a lot, and it was a 7-day-a-week job, reading a lot, and I know much more about tech probably, like you folks here, if I hadn't read so much. I was able to talk about tech. I was able to hold good conversations, I thought, about all kinds of technological things. But in terms of doing hands-on stuff like so many of you are doing, I was often, I wouldn't say Luddite, but sometimes maybe a neo-Luddite or something along those lines. Dyslexic with technology even. It was sometimes felt like my bête noire, but here I was just learning as much as I possibly could. And it was kind of a fascinating enterprise to learn about somebody you're going to interview, to have the opportunity of talking to that person in deep conversation, as deep as you wanted to go or they wanted to go with it, but also to know a lot about he, she, they, and their work.
Yeah, absolutely. Grant Whitehead from Adelaide, Australia asks, if you were starting your career in today's day and age, what would differ to 30 years ago?
Well, I'd have to, for example, be much more mindful of what's been called the woke movement. I mean, there are things now that have become almost unacceptable, and there's a lot of pressure along those lines. Also, just politically, it's a different world than the world I began in. I mean, I would talk to a lot of conservatives in the early years, and would have places like a lot of the conservative groups would, for example, I work on the left coast. I mean, the Bay Area is, known to be left-like, and certainly public radio had a lot of listeners who were on the left. So I would put conservatives on, and I would get a lot of anger feedback that said, what are you putting these fascists on the air for, and that sort of thing. I had to educate my audience to the idea that there are different points of view. You want to hear points of view different than yours so that you can have maybe the necessary tools to go against them if that's your feelings.
Right.
But it was a challenge as things began to change, and the biggest challenge were the Trump years, because suddenly there became, well, there was always a challenge here in the Bay Area getting people from different points of view. I mean, I have people on like George Will or people who are known for their conservatism, but those kind of conservatives, Victor Davis Hanson even, are of a different breed now. Things have been so polarized that it presents challenges that I didn't have. I mean, I had people who would complain when I put somebody on who represented a conservative point of view, but things are much more volatile now, I think, and much more extreme.
Absolutely. Next question is from Jeffrey Powers in Madison, Wisconsin. He said, I've been told to keep your interviews words so that a middle schooler could follow. Do you follow this or cater to the guests that you're interviewing?
I try to keep the discourse on as high a level as I can. And, I've been told through the years that I use a lot of polysyllabic words that might not necessarily be all that amenable to young listeners, as is implicit in the question. But it's the way I talk. And when I was in commercial radio, there was a guy who was technically my boss. He was program director. And he said to me, Michael, I'm worried about that truck driver in San Jose. He doesn't necessarily understand your highfalutin words. We did an anniversary show, and that came up when I was in public radio, and that came up, and some guy called in and said, hey, I'm a truck driver in San Jose. I love, hearing words that you use, because then I become more word powerful, like the old Reader's Digest, knowing these words can make you more word powerful. So I don't try to talk down. I don't try to change the way I speak. The way I speak is the way I speak. It's me. It's authentic. And maybe the biggest lesson I can tell you about interviewing is be authentic above all.
Yeah.
Be yourself. I mean, sometimes, yourself is not necessarily the best self, but be your best self and be as authentic as you can.
And I know one of the things I really enjoyed about it is I felt like your discourse with the interviewees really raised the level of the conversation. That you really felt like you were listening to something that was heady in a way that you don't hear almost anywhere else. And it's one of the things I definitely enjoyed about the show. Next question is from Noah Sargent in Fullerton, California. He says, what is one of the biggest mistakes you see interviewers do?
Well, there are a number of things that come to mind. One is, again, trying to be too much of a show off. I think, that can be an extreme, just like the other side of that.
Mhm.
Trying to hold back too much can be an extreme too. I also, I don't like watching interviewers trying to be patronizing. I don't like interviewers who are trying to be buddy-buddy with the person they're interviewing. There's too much seriousness in my mind in interviewing, unless, you've got somebody who's an entertainer, who's fun to talk to, and it's going to be fun. I remember interviewing Dame Edna, for example, and somebody called from Australia, or joined us from Australia. Dame Edna was this actually ahead of his time, who would dress like a woman and call himself Dame Edna. Very funny and fun to talk to. And sometimes having those kind of guests on, or Robin Williams, who was wonderful to talk to. You couldn't get many words in edgewise, but you could sort of relax interviewing people like that and let it all out, let it kind of hang out, and make it fun.
Is it hard to watch other people interview? Like, because you've done it so much, do you have a situation where you're watching them and you're going, oh, I wouldn't have done that.
All the time.
Because this is your thing, and so you're just like, why did you do that? Why did you go down that path? That seems to be would be hard for me to watch. Do you still watch a lot of other people interviewing, or is it just too hard?
I watch, and sometimes it's very hard, and sometimes it's almost giving me a sort of visceral pain or making me recoil, all kinds of effects along those lines. But I can still get a lot out of what the person is saying and what they're doing and so forth.
Right.
And you can learn from other interviews what works and what doesn't. Watch other interviews. As a kid, I began to understand certain skills from just watching people like Dick Cavett, who I admired, and then I got to interview years later when he defended Woody Allen, and that caused a big, huge outcry from many of my listeners, particularly women. I learned a lot watching Bill Buckley back in the day, So again, from different sides of the political spectrum and different styles, you can learn a great deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our producers who are watching and asking the questions, I would really focus on voting on questions. There's so many coming in. There's no way we're going to get to the bottom of them. So definitely vote. Make sure to look at these questions and order them in the way that you would like us to cover them. Next question is from JJ McKenna in San Rafael, California. More nuts and bolts here. He said, "What was your strategy for learning difficult to pronounce names?"
Well, there's an online service that pronounces names. You put in the name and you in the search engine say, how is it pronounced? If it's somebody who's well known, for example, that becomes easy. You just hear the name. And in fact, they'll give you, if it's somebody from France, they'll give you the Gallic pronunciation. If it's somebody from Germany, the German pronunciation. From Myanmar, the Burmese pronunciation. Is very useful as a tool, but I like to use the common English pronunciations as best I can. And sometimes I would just have my producer ask the person before we went on the air, how do you prefer your last name pronounced? Because there's some very difficult names that you can't really figure just by looking at them. And also have my producer ask, what do you prefer to be addressed as? Doctor or professor,
right,
mayor, chairman, and so forth, chairperson. Those things you just have, and that's nuts and bolts stuff. You get it out of the way and you get it so you have it down as much as possible. I've screwed up some names. I mean, I don't mind telling you that. And I felt bad messing up a few names, but in a career that spanned a number of decades, it was perhaps expected, even after I got the name down or thought I had the name in my head. And then there were people who would get on the air with, and they'd say, they were asked by the producer, what do you prefer? And they'd say anything. And then I'd say, okay, Skip. No, don't call me Skip.
Next question is from Josh Kaufman in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He said, in the early days of broadcast, airtime was so precious that the anchors had little agency or self-expression. Today, virtually anyone can have a voice because of digital media. How will this change the future of media?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball here, and I'm not a futurist, but it's already changed the nature of media in quantum ways, in ways that are immeasurable. I mean, this is a digital world now, and I was joking to Alex the other day about how there are apartments for rent in Manhattan. I read that say podcast studio included in the apartment. I mean, people are establishing themselves or trying to establish themselves in the world of podcasting, and I think it's pretty tough. You know, if you had a network behind you, like I did with NPR or ABC, there was network domination. Most of you remember the days when there would be maybe 3 anchors, white males, you know, on NBC, ABC, and CBS, and then everything changed with cable, and everything changed also with the discourse. It's not as civil, it's not as, shall we say, reasonable as it used to be. There's attempts to get clickbait, and that's the nature of how things are run now. So it's changed enormously, and it continues to change. And not all those changes are things that I must tell you I welcome or feel good about. Yeah. The clickbait stuff, for example, has been taken to such extremes. When you have something like Alex Jones's InfoWars, you know, saying that it was all faked up there in that terrible massacre of children. What's he trying to do? Does he believe that, you know, that there was a conspiracy against gun owners, or is he trying to get clickbaits? I don't know. But he's got a lot of listeners and a lot of people who really feel that he's an important voice. And in many ways, you could say it's great that we have all these different voices, but it also has consequences. Just like when television started or when the internet started, people welcomed all of the changes, and they were great to some degree, but they also carried all kinds of consequences. I mean, think about Facebook, for example. And people used to call me and say, we're connecting the world from Facebook. You know, we're doing all these wonderful things. We're making people connect in ways that they never even dreamed of. And that was all true. And, you know, you can find out things about friends and so forth and keep up with them in ways you hadn't imagined possible. But then, you know, we had an election, and we had what happened in Myanmar or Burma, what's happening ongoing in India because of Facebook. There's a lot of consequences that simply no one had taken stock of, and no one really could have measured, particularly not Zuckerberg or Sheryl Sandberg.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill Davis in San Diego asks, you mentioned talking points, which seems to me have degraded the ability to actually have a discussion rather than the interviewee performance. How can someone best counteract the canned response syndrome?
Again, I think you got to trust your gut on this. If this sounds like a canned response, and I've actually put people on the spot, you can tell sometimes pretty transparently that you're hearing a canned response. And I wouldn't necessarily use that language, canned response, but you can say to somebody, you know, you've probably given a lot of interviews, and you've been asked questions along these lines before. I'd like to go to something more challenging here, or maybe something that you haven't been asked before. I mean, that's a good setup for you to move away from the can, something along those lines. I'm not trying to give you boilerplate language, but something along those lines can be very useful and very helpful. And again, you know when you're getting a canned response about 9 times out of 10. There are some interviewees who are very deft at giving a canned response that doesn't sound canned. I mean, they even have little things down pat that they make to sound like they're improvisational or they're off the hook. And yet, sometimes the best thing to do is to steer your interviewee away from that. So you get something more original, you get something more enlightening, frankly.
Absolutely. Jeffrey Powers in Madison, Wisconsin asks, any tips to give if you're in the middle of a comment or question and forget the direction you were going? Have you been there?
Happens more as you get older. No brilliant tips on that sort. Sometimes, you know, I would just pick it up and say, you know, let me go back to what we were talking about before. Were you trying to clarify?
Right.
I mean, just use something like that. In other words, it's a prompt that gets you back centered on what was being discussed.
Right.
Or can I hear that idea once more from you and maybe speak about it in more general terms or more specific terms? Or, I mean, there are just handles like that to move things. You're always moving things forward, by the way. Just, I mean, it's a good lesson for life too. I don't mean to be a wise man here or a wise ass, but moving forward is just keep moving. A lot of the geriatric experts keep saying, and they're right.
Ray Franklin in Mount Dora, Florida, asks, Larry King never read a book or did much research before an interview. He wanted to be interested in. He wanted to be an interested interviewer, asking the guest to inform. Is this proven wrong from your experience?
Well, it was right for Larry King. I mean, he had a colossal career and kept on a career even after he left CNN and was doing a lot of infomercials and things along those lines. I once said to Larry King, I met him a few times and I said, just joking around with him, I'm the anti-Larry King. I always read the book, or at least try to read some of it. And, Larry would come in, he was a schmoozer. He would come into the interview and he'd say, so tell me about this book, or the title. What do you mean by the title? And why did you choose this title? I mean, they would be almost boilerplate type questions like that. But he would get people to talk. And sometimes that's what you're there for, is to get people to talk. And he did it in ways that were not consonant with the ways I like to get people to talk, because I like more conversation two-way and all the rest of that. But he was quite successful. And so does what I'm saying disprove the Larry King method of interviewing? Not necessarily. But if you're going to interview like Larry King, you better be damn good at it.
Sometimes there's only one way to do that. You have to be, because a lot of it is, as an interviewer, a mixture of all the things in your personality that make it work. Next question is from Josh Kaufman in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He said, what are the dynamics of a TV video interview versus one that is only recorded on audio? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each?
Well, I did live television. I also did recorded television. And, the thing about television is that's so different is you're much more aware of the visual. At least I was much more aware of things like appearance and how am I coming across and is the camera getting me? And I remember the first time I did a TV show, I was looking at the camera and the director said to me, just let the camera follow you, Michael. Don't look at the camera. And it was good advice because if you have, competent and able people, they can follow you and they should be able to follow you regardless of what you're doing or how you're moving your body or your head or whatever.
Right.
You're with TV viewers, that old saw I told you about is, I think, instructive. You have to capture attention much quicker. I did some TV news editorials and it was much more important for the producers to have the visuals. Let's shoot this, on Treasure Island, or let's shoot this, over at in the Mission. I'm just talking about local places here in the Bay Area. The setting and how you appear in the setting was central, and to some degree more important in the producers' minds, in my experience, than the content. The content was certainly important in terms of keeping listeners and viewers, but at the same time, it's to such a great extent a more visual medium.
Do you think
they talk about radio. Radio is a theater of the mind.
Right.
I used to have a T-shirt that said that, and there's a lot of truth to that because you're not seeing things. You're having to put things forward just in language. Sorry.
Do you think the video is a distraction from the conversation?
Can be. Yeah. Depends. I think that conversation is much more in some ways enhanced by what I did in radio, and that's not crowing. It's just a fact of having worked in both medias.
Absolutely. Hosmuk Gajar in Cape Town, South Africa, asks, have you had the opportunity to interview anyone from South Africa pre or post apartheid? What did you learn if you had this opportunity?
I did have an opportunity. In fact, there were a couple of really good books on South Africa, both pre-apartheid and post-apartheid. There was a fine documentary film about the strike that was a good example, again, of police over brutality, or however you want to describe it. I also had the great privilege of interviewing Desmond Tutu, and I interviewed Adam Hochschild, who his father owned. He was one of the co-founder of Mother Jones magazine, but was originally from South Africa. His father was in the diamond business, and Adam became, how shall I say, a progressive leftist, if you will, and very anti-apartheid, and had a great story to tell. He also wrote King Leopold's Ghost and wrote some great books. He wrote a book about the Spanish Civil War and the First World War, but his book about South Africa, his first book, and his own boyhood, I thought was poignant and wonderful. It was a lot about father-son relationship. So yeah, I've done a lot through the years about South Africa, and interviewed some of the members of, I never had the distinct honor of interviewing Nelson Mandela, but interviewed many people who were close to him, and journalists who worked in South Africa and wrote about South Africa.
What did you think you learned from those interviews, or what did you take from those?
Well, people used to ask me if I was pessimistic about the future in terms of geopolitics and so forth, because I did a lot of interviews on international relations and with people who were in the international arena. And South Africa was, for me, a hopeful sign in many ways, because there were times under de Klerk when everybody thought this could never change, just like they thought the Soviet Union would never break up, and you could never have glasnost or perestroika. There's reason for hope in seeing what happened in South Africa and apartheid, falling, and Mandela taking over as head of state. One can be less optimistic or sanguine now about what's happened in Russia under Putin, but at the same time, things do sometimes move in a different direction that you hadn't anticipated or expected. And that's true of South Africa. I remember when they were lining up to vote in South Africa, I thought if they could only be this way in the United States, treasuring and cherishing their franchise to go and vote. I'm talking, of course, about Black people and people of color, because they had been denied their franchise. And they valued it to such a great degree. It was inspiring.
Lois Richter asks from Davis, California, are you still doing interviews even after retirement?
And the answer is yes. I'm doing a lot more, in fact, than I thought I would be, because I'm trying to write a book, another book, and I've been involved in a lot of philanthropic work. But that's also why I think I was asked to do a series of interviews for the National Philanthropy Day and I was actually privileged to do that. They decided to have people from the nonprofit sector in the Black community here in the Bay Area, and also the Latino community, or is now called Latinx, and American Indian and Chinese American. And it was really very compelling, I thought, to talk to those people who represent those different ethnic communities and what they need in the way and what they want in the way of philanthropy and how they prioritize philanthropy. I do events every year for the National Kidney Foundation. They have a literary luncheon. This year they did interviews. I did interview, as I said, with Amor Tolles, also with Elizabeth Stroud, who won a Pulitzer, and with Walter Mosley, a name some of you may remember from Bill Clinton saying that was his favorite author, who's written both detective novels about Easy Rawlins, a Black detective, and other novels. Yeah, I'm still doing a lot. I did Book Passage, which is a major chain that's located here in Northern California, but during the pandemic, had a Zoom interview show. I did an interview with Brad Stone, who wrote a couple books about Amazon for them, and then did one with Miklas Sal, our local film critic. I keep on interviewing, let's put it that way. And I enjoy it, and so I do it. And as long as I have my faculties, I'll continue to do it.
That's great. Josh Kaufman asks, when a host is intimately acquainted with a guest, the audience may feel less engaged. How does a host focus on being a better advocate for the audience in these circumstances?
Well, that has a lot to do, again, with putting yourself in the role of the audience and thinking, what are strangers going to be interested in about this person I'm interviewing. And sometimes, you can go into left field. That's how I characterize it. You have a guest on and like asking Billy D. Williams about his mother, that was a natural thing to do. But if you're curious about people and you want to know about people,
Right.
and some of you, are asking me questions now about the work I've done, you can go beyond the work and you can ask, you don't want to get too personal here and talk about, the one thing I actually admire about Howard Stern as an interviewer is he goes into verboten topics, asks people about their sex lives and money and how much they have or property that they have. These are things that I tended to avoid. My mother used to say, it's not good form to talk about sex, religion, or politics, but there are 3 things you'd be hard pressed to find more interesting. So sometimes it's just useful and valuable to, say to somebody, tell me about your background, or just even an open question like that, or they come from Omaha or something. Were there any particular influences in your background in Nebraska that led you to where you are? Those kinds of questions seem a little hokey, but they can be very useful in opening things up and getting a person to talk in a way that isn't just circumscribed.
Yeah, absolutely. Noah Sargent from Fullerton, California asks, do you prefer broad questions or specific questions? And do you start with one and then move to another?
I like both, depending what I want to know or depending what I think my listeners want to know. Sometimes you go from the general to the specific. It's a natural way, it's a natural way of writing essays and so forth, as I used to say when I taught English composition. But sometimes it's good just to begin with a specific question, particularly a provocative question, and a question that can raise the temperature a bit. It's not necessarily creating controversy for its own sake, but when you have controversy, you usually have interesting interviews in terms of the listenings to those interviews. I've been writing, as I said, a book now, and it's not about interviews. It's about race. Because I've been moved by a lot of the debates that are going on about critical race theory and all the rest of these kinds of things. And this is maybe an instructive story in some ways. I had Bill Cosby on, and Bill Cosby had not yet gone into the courtroom to answer for his behavior or misbehavior, or that's even too gentle a characterization. The dreadful and frankly wretched things he did to young women that's now been corroborated and that he was prosecuted for successfully. There were a lot of rumors at that time about Cosby, and there were even jokes on Saturday Night Live, and a stand-up comic brought things back into focus so that women brought charges against him, but nothing had ever been adjudicated. And this was one of the strangest interviews I ever had, because in the middle of the interview, he said, my doorbell's ringing, and he left. And there's an old saying in radio broadcasting that sometimes you have to tap dance. And that was a good example of, where did my interviewee go? He went to answer
He just disappeared.
the doorbell.
He walked away and then he was gone.
And he came back in a few minutes, but then the doorbell, he said, rang again. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It sounds like fiction. But I really was agonizing. Should I ask him about these rumors? Because at the time they were just rumors. There was nothing substantial, and I had to avoid it and not ask him. But in retrospect, I think maybe it would have been a good idea if I did.
Right. James Babbitt in San Diego says, hi, Michael. As a teacher, did you move from teaching in classrooms to teaching online?
Yes, I did. I just finished a 10-week course at Stanford online, and I did one for Santa Clara, and I may do one for my own university. That is the university where I taught for many decades, San Francisco State. They're online now, but they're not going to probably remain online. Some of this is hybrid stuff now because of the pandemic. Stanford will be having their classes no longer online. I don't know if I want to go down to Stanford to teach classes. I have to decide that.
Isn't that interesting?
Just 10 weeks.
That's an interesting, I feel like that's an interesting thing that's happened is that I find that I was asked to speak in Southern California, and I said, hey, if you want me to come in virtually, I'm happy to come in from my office, but I'm not going to take 3 days to talk for an hour. Like it was, have you found that that Zoom has made it possible for you to not want to necessarily travel as much?
Absolutely. Zoom has changed our world, I think. I sometimes think when my kids were growing up, what would it have been like if we'd had a pandemic without Zoom? I mean, it's kind of horrifying to even contemplate that prospect. But, you know, I went to give a talk at Chautauqua because I wanted to go to Chautauqua. It's kind of Aspen, the East Coast, and it has some great roots going back to Thomas Edison even, and the Methodist Church started it in the 19th century, and it's kind of a culture hub. And I was given keynote status with Louis Black, a comedian, stand-up comedian, and that was kind of fun working with him. But I still get a lot of interest in the private sector and so forth, and I have to kind of sift and winnow. Do I want to, you know, go off to do something? I used to love the idea of, you know, traveling to do big CEO or events with CEOs in all parts of the world.
Right.
But now, when you can go online and just do a Zoom, it's a lot more attractive, frankly. And plus, traveling is dangerous now. I mean, you know, I thought in my retirement I'd be doing a lot more traveling, frankly, but I don't know with variants what's safe anymore. I mean, I think you're safe in the airplane. It's just, you know, when you go through TSA or you're in the airport, that you're probably less safe than you are on the airplane with its good ventilation systems. But then you're exposing yourself to a different world, literally, when you go to a different place. So all that's in the balance now. All that's unpredictable.
Absolutely. Josh Kaufman in Pittsburgh asks, how has your love of literature informed your discourse? What recommended reading would you suggest for an aspiring interviewer?
Literature informs almost everything I do because literature, the study of literature for me was, I never thought of myself as a polymath, but I certainly had interest in many, many topics. And, you know, you can read and teach a novel linguistically and sociologically and psychologically and anthropologically and scientifically and historically and so forth. So it opens up. The best advice I used to give to aspiring talk show hosts was be a generalist, you know, develop interest as much as you can in just about every topic conceivable in all content. And literature's done that for me and played a central role. As far as advocating or mentioning certain writers, you know, we could do just a whole Zoom on that. Remember, I was teaching much longer than I was a broadcaster, and
you know, you say that, and we're, you know, you're goading us on to bring you back on.
Yeah, well, once you get the delight of teaching, and you know, I really did find it enormously rewarding, and had some of the best experiences of my career working with students, both individually and in the classroom. Classroom teaching excited me. It got me highly energetic. I loved it and was passionate about it. I still feel that way. But to give you recommendations, you know, I had reading lists and so forth. You know, are we talking about American literature? Are we talking about world literature? For a while, I had this is one of the reasons I wanted to write another book. I had the rare privilege of teaching Black literature. 1970, this was after the strike at San Francisco State. So things were still pretty militant, and that was the word that was often used. There was a lot of anger. I don't think a white professor could go into a class of Black students and teach Black literature in today's world. I think it would almost be impossible. But it was some of the most rewarding experiences of my teaching career. And I think there were things that I learned that are important at teaching in that experience. Let me know what kind of writing you want to, or what kind of literature you can send me an email or something, what kind of literature you're interested in, and I can give you recommendations. But as far as reading literature that helped my interviewing career, my broadcast journalism career, it was mostly, I taught fiction and poetry and drama. And most of the books that helped me were books that were nonfiction, that talked about the interviewing process, that talked about ways to storehouse knowledge better, or ways to be better informed, or things along those lines. And there's, again, a whole list of a long bibliography.
Our last question for the hour comes from Kyle Hammond, and he says, what's your next next project? Is it still, what's still just an idea that you're working on?
Well, I wrote a book on, the subject was honor. It was something that always interested me, and my agent has it. And I think we're going to probably have to go through, if somebody decides they want to publish it, we're going to have to go through another draft or two. And then I got into this, it was just a few essays on race, and it's turned into, I think, another book. And I honestly didn't know I had another book in me. So that's all happening. We got a dog, and that's been, I thought of buying one of those T-shirts that said, I thought I was retired, now my dog is my boss.
It's a very excited dog.
Yeah, Alex got to meet the dog's name is Stella, and if you're of a certain generation, you think of Marlon Brando screaming Stella. Other generations think about maybe Stella McCartney or something. It's like a Rorschach, you know, for what age group siloed. At this stage of life, a puppy was not the wisest move that I've made, and now I just did an event. Speaking about interviews, I did an event for the Humane Society. And interviewed Jennifer Egan, who is a personal friend. Some of you may know, wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning novel called A Visit from the Goon Squad. And it was a fundraiser for the Humane Society. But they didn't ask me, fortunately, what kind of dog I had, because if you don't get a rescue dog now, you're labeled as a breedist. Oh. This may be a new word to some of you. It was to me.
Yeah.
But you're only supposed to get rescue dogs to be, you know, politically correct, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I got a golden retriever, and it's a good dog. But you know, when you raise a dog from puppyhood, there are challenges every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael Krasny, thank you so much for your time. It's just such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. And Alex, I think you're doing, you know, extraordinary work here. I got to hear the first hour and the questions that were asked. It's a very smart group of people, and Carrie, onward and upward. Good
Thanks.
to be with you.
Hopefully we'll find another excuse to bring you on.
Well, thank you for your attention. Much obliged.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Michael. And thanks to our producers for a fantastic set of questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. That was an enormous, incredible output there. And thank you to the panelists for the great answers in the first hour, and also the questions that you asked in the second hour. Thank you for all the contribution that you make here. And now we're going to jump in. Reminder that right after this, we're going to be jumping into doing Isadora. So that's happening right after this. Will be like a little bit of a break, and then we'll jump right into that. And then we have MakerPike. David Schlitter will be here tomorrow to talk about MakerPipe and probably answer some of your questions, question some of your answers, talk about how we got started. All right.